It began as a vibration rather than a sound, an indistinct tremor folding through the night air over the Western Front. German infantry settled into their shallow positions along a line of battered orchards and stone-walled farms, paused to listen. The rumble was too steady to be armor, too distant to be mortars, and too shapeless to assign to any known battery. Men glanced toward the horizon, searching for the familiar arcs of muzzle flash. None appeared. The night remained unbroken, yet the earth continued to murmur. A few hundred meters away, hidden behind a tangled hedgerow slick with evening dew, a lone American forward observer lay prone beside a compact radio. He spoke quietly, barely more than breath against static, reciting precise coordinates measured from a pre-registered grid. His words were not dramatic. They were integers and bearings, delivered with the practiced calm of someone who understood that accuracy, not volume, decided survival. When he released the key, the hedgerow swallowed the silence again. The response came in 20 measured seconds. The first shells struck with the clipped certainty of a craftsman's tools, punching into a German trench line as if guided by an invisible hand. The next salvo walked forward, each detonation exactly where the previous ended, leaving no pause for adjustment or escape. What startled the Germans was not only the precision, but the tempo. Too fast for traditional British methods, and far too selective for Soviet-style saturation. Veterans later recalled that American fire seemed to arrive before the attackers themselves were even visible. They remembered the unsettling impression that the shells were not fired in emotion or urgency, but released according to a predetermined logic. Each round felt like the consequence of a calculation completed elsewhere. As the bombardment deepened, confusion spread through the German line. Movements that once felt instinctive, ducking, running, finding new cover, became futile under concentrations that shifted with uncanny timing. Entire positions collapsed without warning, erased not by overwhelming numbers, but by the quiet certainty of coordinated fire. In those minutes, a realization settled across the front. The Americans were employing something different, something colder. The weapon they feared most was not a tank, nor a barrage. It was mathematics delivered at high velocity, and its true reach had only just begun. Night on the Western Front had once belonged to the Germans. Darkness offered concealment, a measure of predictability, and the comforting thought that artillery, like most machines, struggled when deprived of light. But by late 1944, officers along several sectors began to notice a pattern that unsettled even the most seasoned among them. American barrages were arriving after dusk, with a coordination that defied expectation, shells falling in tightly grouped patterns, shifting with deliberate purpose, as if guided by a system that did not sleep. The reason lay far behind the tree lines, inside small wooden huts and repurposed barns, marked only by faint lamplight. Within these improvised rooms, U.S. fire direction centers arranged slide rules, plotting boards, grease pencils, and telephones into a quiet chain of computation. A forward observer's whispered grid coordinates could be transformed within seconds into firing data for guns scattered miles apart. It was a system built not on intuition, but on procedure, each step reducing uncertainty, each calculation tightening the circle around a target unseen. What astonished the Germans was how swiftly this machinery could be invoked. A single observer, crouched in a ditch or perched in the upper floor of a ruined farmhouse, could call upon dozens of guns without waiting for headquarters approval. Authority traveled through function, not rank, and decisions emerged from the arithmetic of range and bearing rather than the deliberation of command. To men on the receiving end, it felt as though the artillery had acquired its own intelligence, answering threats with a speed no human hierarchy could match. Survivors described these barrages as surgical, a word rarely used in a war that had so often relied on volume rather than precision. They noted how American fire lacked the turbulent excess of Eastern Front bombardments. Instead, it arrived as a series of calculated strikes, each placement purposeful, each correction instantaneous. The effect was psychological as much as physical, an impression that the battlefield was being measured in real time. Within U.S. units, the technique was spreading quickly. Guns from multiple battalions, even from separate divisions, were beginning to fire as if they were a single battery. And for an army designed around rapid movement, this invisible reach revealed a new kind of strength, one their enemies had not yet learned to counter. But the full weight of this discovery had only begun to surface, and the next stage would make the darkness feel even less forgiving. At dawn, a company of German engineers reached a modest crossroads in Normandy, a place no different from 100 others. Two narrow lanes meeting beneath a cluster of apple trees, a ditch running along the verge, and a farmhouse ruined by weeks of fighting. Their task was routine. They were to strengthen the junction with trenches, wire, and hasty firing points before the Americans could press closer. Shovels struck soil, picks bit into the clay, and for a few quiet minutes the war seemed to hold its breath. They never finished the first trench. The opening shells descended without warning, scattering earth and equipment in a blast pattern so tight it felt more like deliberate excavation than chaos. Within seconds, the crossroads vanished beneath a storm of steel, shells spaced with uncanny regularity, each impact aligned as if tracing a grid only the Americans could see. Men who had dug through the worst of the Eastern Front now found themselves pinned beneath a barrage that ignored the usual rhythms of artillery. There was no ranging shot, no adjustment, no pause. The fire was correct from the first moment. Hours later, survivors would learn that the architect of their destruction had been a single American sergeant positioned high in a church tower half a kilometer away. From that vantage, with only a radio and a map, he had called in the fire of an entire battalion. To the Germans who endured it, the notion felt unreal, that one man could summon such concentrated violence with the precision of a surveyor. Their diaries captured the shock in plain language. They wrote of American artillery as relentless, as a force that could not be outrun, unavoidable because it corrected faster than they could shift position, and inhumanly efficient, not in cruelty, but in its refusal to waste a single round. This was not random shelling born of urgency. It was a method executed with mathematical detachment, reducing strong points to coordinates and coordinates to silence. In the weeks that followed, commanders on both sides began to recognize a quiet truth. Artillery was becoming the American Army's defining advantage, shaping each engagement before infantry or armor even arrived. And as the front line crept eastward, it became increasingly clear that this was no longer a story of weapons alone, but of a doctrine reshaping the battlefield with invisible hands. Yet for all that the Germans had witnessed, they had not yet seen the system operating at its full scale, and that revelation was still ahead. Long before the war reached its turning points, Germany carried into battle a deep and unshakable confidence in its artillery. It was a tradition forged over generations, Krupp workshops producing steel of almost mythic reputation, optics refined through decades of engineering, and gun crews drilled to an exacting standard. For officers raised in this culture, the German artillery arm was not merely a component of warfare. It was an inheritance, a demonstration of national precision applied to the battlefield. In their view, no other army matched their blend of craftsmanship and discipline. This belief rested on real capability. The 8.8-centimeter gun, later known simply as the 88, had already become a symbol of lethal efficiency, capable of punching through armor at distances where most enemies struggled even to identify its silhouette. The 105mm LEFH and the heavy 150mm howitzers added depth to the field, forming a triad of weapons that could engage armor, infantry, and fortifications with equal assurance. German crews practiced their craft as if it were a mathematical performance, each step rehearsed until motion itself became a form of calculation. Their doctrine matched this confidence. German artillery control remained close to the front, tied to officers who were expected to sense the rhythm of battle directly. Fire support flowed through local commanders, who issued orders with minimal interference from higher headquarters. The method had worked in Poland, in France, and across the early stages of the Eastern Front. Barrages fell quickly, often within minutes of identification, and early victories reinforced the notion that German responsiveness was unrivaled. Allies would later note that German forward observers seemed almost fused to their batteries, adjusting fire with an instinctive precision seldom seen elsewhere. By the time American forces appeared in North Africa in late 1942, this belief had hardened into expectation. The U.S. artillery units that first deployed to Tunisia were inexperienced, lacking cohesion, and spread thin across rugged ground. Their fire missions often arrived late or scattered, with observers struggling to coordinate multiple batteries under pressure. German officers watching these early engagements concluded that American artillery was slow, disorganized, and fundamentally unimpressive. The Wehrmacht saw an army still learning its trade, while Germany had already mastered its own. Reports from Africa Corps commanders reflected this sentiment with quiet confidence. They described American shelling as erratic and hesitant, a force that relied on volume rather than control. To them, the U.S. gunners seemed unsure of their own procedures, compensating with more rounds rather than better accuracy. And because the Americans were still adapting to combined arms operations, German units rarely felt threatened by their artillery. The impression was clear. Here was a newcomer, ambitious but unrefined. This early judgment shaped German expectations for the rest of the war. Many believed the competition in firepower was already settled, that German engineering, German doctrine, and German experience guaranteed permanent superiority. It was an assumption that went unchallenged through much of 1942 and into 1943, reinforced by every encounter that confirmed their bias. What they could not yet see was that the Americans were quietly building something different, something not born of tradition, but of analysis, and it would overturn every certainty the Germans carried into battle. In the months after their first encounters with the Africa Corps, American commanders faced an uncomfortable truth. Their artillery system, admired on paper, faltered in practice. Reports from Tunisia revealed delays measured not in seconds, but in long, dangerous minutes. Batteries struggled to synchronize. Observers lacked reliable communication, and procedures varied from unit to unit. Instead of dismissing these failures as the growing pains of a young army, senior officers treated them as a mandate for reinvention. What followed was less a correction than a reconstruction, a methodical rebuilding of the entire artillery apparatus from the ground up. The cornerstone of this reform was a simple but radical idea. Authority should live with the men closest to the fight. Decentralized fire control broke with decades of military convention. Instead of routing requests through layers of headquarters, the U.S. Army empowered forward observers to call directly for the guns they needed, even from battalions not assigned to their sector. The concept sounded chaotic to traditionalists, But in practice, it unlocked a form of battlefield agility unknown to older doctrines. A sergeant with a radio could within seconds redirect the weight of an entire regiment. To support this speed, American units turned to mathematics. Slide rules, firing tables, and standardized plotting methods became the silent partners of every fire mission. Crews drilled until calculations that once took minutes could be completed almost automatically. The transformation was not glamorous. It lived in notebooks, in the faint scratch of pencils across coordinate sheets, in checklists repeated until they felt instinctive. But each improvement shortened the gap between observation and impact, and in artillery, that gap was life. Manufacturing reinforced this precision. American industry produced guns with a level of uniformity rarely seen in wartime. A 105mm howitzer in Sicily behaved identically to one in Normandy, down to the smallest mechanical tolerances. Powder charges, shells, and fuses adhered to strict specifications. This predictability allowed gunners to trust their instruments absolutely, reducing the need for adjustment rounds and enabling the kind of immediate accuracy that astonished enemy troops. Radios completed the transformation. Distributed widely across infantry and reconnaissance units, they extended the reach of artillery far beyond static observation posts. Forward observers became roaming eyes for entire divisions, able to request and redirect fire with a freedom that reshaped the tempo of combat. A hilltop, a tower, a single ruined attic, any vantage point could become a nerve center for coordinated destruction miles to the rear. By 1944, the U.S. Triumph Army had evolved into the most responsive artillery force in the world. The change was quiet, born not of new weapons, but of procedure, mathematics, and an acceptance that flexibility mattered as much as firepower. German intelligence noted the shift, but failed to grasp its magnitude. Their reports mentioned quicker reactions, tighter groupings, and a growing sense of unpredictability. But by the time they understood the pattern, the doctrine behind it was already reshaping battlefields across Europe, and soon the consequences of this reinvention would reveal themselves in ways neither side had yet imagined. In the first months of 1944, as the Channel winds hardened and the rumors of an Allied landing multiplied, German commanders viewed the coming battle with a sense of practiced assurance. They had spent years mastering defensive warfare, shaping terrain, directing fire, and timing counterattacks with a precision that had held larger armies at bay. In their eyes, the invasion would be a severe test, but not an unfamiliar one. Their divisions along the Atlantic Wall prepared as though the old rhythm of war still governed events. They placed their trust in fortifications that had taken 18 months to complete, casemates set in concrete, interlocking fields of fire, and artillery positioned to sweep the beaches before an attacker could consolidate. The doctrine of flexible defense, refined on the Eastern Front, remained their anchor. It taught that a disciplined withdrawal could lure the enemy into exposed positions, where German guns and mobile reserves would restore control. The theory assumed time, space, and a predictable flow of combat, ingredients the Germans believed they still possessed. Among artillery units, confidence was even stronger. They expected to dominate any static fight along the coast, just as they had across Europe since 1939. Batteries drilled in the familiar patterns of forward observation, officer-led adjustment, and carefully measured fire missions. Messages ran through established channels designed to preserve order and prevent waste. German gunners assumed that once the Allies committed themselves to the shore, they would be held in place long enough for methodical fire to break their cohesion. Few questioned whether this structure could match an enemy operating under different principles. The decentralized American system, with its roaming observers and instant communication, still seemed to many German officers like an improvisation rather than a doctrine. They dismissed reports of rapid U.S. fire missions as isolated events, not as evidence of a changing battlefield. The idea that artillery could be both precise and mobile defied their assumptions about how large forces must operate. When the Allies landed in June, these assumptions shattered with startling speed. German batteries prepared for the orderly sequences they had rehearsed, but the battlefield offered none. American observers, working from dunes, hedgerows, and even moving vehicles, called for fire with a fluidity that German headquarters struggled to interpret. Entire missions that once required layers of approval now unfolded in seconds. Positions that should have been safe for minutes at a time were erased almost as quickly as they were identified. German command structures, optimized for officer-led execution, found themselves unable to match the tempo. Orders met delays, corrections arrived too late, counterattacks were broken apart before they reached their starting points. What had once been a reliable system now felt rigid, slow, and strangely vulnerable. By midsummer, the belief in German tactical superiority, so long a foundation of their confidence, had begun to crack. The war was revealing a quiet truth. The battlefield had changed without them, and their preparations belonged to a world that no longer existed. By the summer of 1944, as hedgerows turned the Norman countryside into a maze of narrow lanes and enclosed fields, a new rhythm emerged behind American lines. It was not the roar of tanks or the pulse of infantry advances. It was the quiet, deliberate murmur of fire direction centers, rooms lit by dim lamps, filled with the rasp of pencils on plotting boards, and staffed by soldiers who rarely saw the enemy yet shaped every battle. These centers functioned like mechanical computers in human form, converting raw observations into firing data with a speed that no other army in the field could match. Inside each FDC, every gun in the battalion was represented as a fixed point on a geometric grid. Distances were measured in meters, bearings in mils, elevations in exact degrees. The system allowed crews to perform calculations with startling efficiency. A single call from a forward observer could be translated into firing solutions for dozens of howitzers scattered across orchards, hedgerows, and camouflaged clearings. What once required careful adjustment now unfolded in a seamless sequence that felt almost automated. The accuracy of these missions depended not only on mathematics, but on constant environmental knowledge. American meteorological units worked tirelessly, releasing weather balloons at scheduled intervals to measure wind speed, air density, temperature, and humidity. These small data points, often overlooked in other armies, were fed directly into firing tables. The result was artillery that behaved less like a guess of physics and more like an exact answer. Shells landed where they were intended, not roughly, not approximately, but with the precision of a practiced instrument. German soldiers soon encountered the full consequence of this system in a tactic that had rarely been perfected before: the time-on-target barrage. In theory, the concept was simple. Guns at different distances from a target would fire at calculated intervals so that every shell arrived at the same moment. In practice, it required mathematical discipline of the highest order. When executed correctly, the enemy received no warning. There was no gradual escalation, no identifiable pattern to signal incoming fire. Instead, positions were consumed in a single, synchronized moment of eruption, as though the earth beneath them had decided to betray its own defenders. The psychological effect was immense. Survivors described the sensation not as bombardment, but as instantaneous catastrophe. Digging in offered little security. Movement offered none at all. A trench might be intact 1 second and unrecognizable the next. Officers accustomed to hearing the first ranging shot before seeking cover now found themselves exposed without time, even to shout an order. The precision stripped away their sense of control, a quiet but devastating shift in the emotional landscape of the battlefield. German counter-battery units struggled to fight an enemy that refused to stay still. American batteries rarely fired more than a few missions from the same position. The moment they revealed themselves, they displaced, sometimes after minutes, sometimes after a single barrage. Sound-ranging teams and flash-spotting crews, once the pride of German artillery intelligence, found themselves chasing ghosts across the countryside. Every calculation they performed was outdated by the time it reached the plotting table. What frustrated German commanders was not merely the speed of American fire, but its adaptability. U.S. units treated artillery not as a supporting branch, but as an integral element of maneuver. Infantry called for fire as naturally as they called for reinforcements. Armor used it to rupture defensive lines with precision rather than brute force. Even reconnaissance patrols learned to employ artillery as an extension of their own eyes, guiding fire from hilltops or tree lines to break open enemy positions before withdrawing into the landscape. Innovation had become America's greatest weapon. It lived in the discipline of meteorology, in the uniformity of manufacturing, in the quiet confidence of procedures repeated until perfect. It turned ordinary guns into instruments of synchronized destruction and allowed divisions to fight with a cohesion the Germans had never anticipated. This was not the artillery of 1918, nor the doctrinal inheritance of Europe's older armies. It was a new form of warfare, mathematical, responsive, and relentlessly adaptive. And as the front pushed inland from the beaches, this fusion of technology and doctrine began to reshape the character of the entire campaign, preparing the ground for a transformation the Germans were still struggling to comprehend. As the Normandy campaign deepened, German infantry began to accept a truth they had once refused to believe. Survival demanded invisibility. The traditional patterns of movement, columns advancing along sunken lanes, squads regrouping behind orchards, platoons forming up before an assault, had become dangerously predictable. American observers, scattered like silent sentinels across hedgerows and ridgelines, needed only the faintest glimpse of motion to summon a storm. German units responded by digging deeper, dispersing wider, and moving only when the landscape itself offered concealment. Yet even these precautions felt increasingly fragile, as though the very earth no longer offered refuge. The introduction of the American proximity fuse accelerated this shift from caution to dread. Unlike conventional shells that required precise fusing, these rounds detonated when they sensed a change in atmospheric density, an invisible calculation performed in mid-air. The effect was devastating. Instead of burying themselves harmlessly in soft soil, shells burst overhead, releasing spheres of shrapnel that swept open terrain with lethal efficiency. A squad caught in the open no longer faced the dangers of fragmentation alone. It faced geometry itself, a pattern of destruction tailored to human height and formation. German veterans would later recall that proximity-fused fire felt less like bombardment and more like being cut down by a weapon that understood where men were likely to stand. Columns attempting to relocate between villages encountered the new reality first. March routes that had once been routine became stretches of exposure where the smallest error carried fatal consequences. A sighting by a single American patrol could freeze an entire battalion in its tracks. Trucks, half-tracks, and marching troops moved under the constant threat of mid-air detonation. Accounts from the period describe columns shredded mid-march, vehicles overturned, radios silenced, and units forced to abandon roads altogether for the unreliable safety of fields and forest lines. Movement became less about strategy and more about avoiding the unseen eye that seemed to follow them. Morale, already strained by the relentless pace of Allied operations, eroded further under this new threat. German soldiers spoke of being hunted by an enemy they could not locate. There were no gun flashes to track, no predictable patterns of ranging fire. Shells arrived as if guided by instinct rather than observation. Men who had survived years on the Eastern Front found themselves unnerved by the precision and suddenness of American artillery. The psychological burden grew heavier with each passing week as the boundary between caution and paralysis narrowed. Officers struggled to maintain order in an environment where traditional command structures faltered. Assembly points, essential to reorganizing scattered units, became liabilities. A grove of trees chosen to conceal a regrouping platoon might instead become a beacon for American gunners. A crossroads for coordinating counterattacks could vanish under a single, well-timed concentration. Even written orders warned commanders to avoid predictable positions, yet unpredictability offered no guarantee. Every location felt temporary. Every plan carried the shadow of sudden destruction. Even elite formations found themselves constrained. Panzerlehr, among the most experienced and well-equipped divisions in the German army, discovered that maneuver itself had become a provocation. Its armored vehicles, designed for aggressive movement and rapid counterattack, drew American fire as soon as they assembled in numbers. Reconnaissance paths that once promised speed now invited disaster. The division's commanders recognized that they could no longer shape the battle through mobility. Each attempt to reposition was met not by Allied tanks or infantry, but by coordinated artillery that arrived too quickly, too accurately, and too often. By late July, the struggle had taken on a new character. It was no longer defined by clashes at the hedgerows or armored thrusts across narrow lanes. It was defined by the constant effort to evade a weapon that required no direct line of sight, no favorable terrain, and no extended preparation. The Americans had turned artillery into more than a supporting arm. They had turned it into a silent net stretched across the front, flexible, invisible, and devastatingly responsive. And as German units grappled with this new reality, the scale of the coming catastrophe was beginning to take shape, carried not by infantry or armor, but by the relentless mathematics of American fire. By midsummer in Normandy, it had become clear that American artillery was not a standalone arm, but the center of a larger design. It functioned as part of a system, an interconnected architecture of infantry, armor, engineers, and aircraft, all woven together by radio nets and standardized procedures. Each branch carried its own responsibilities, yet all deferred to the same principle. No element would fight alone. Firepower was not a response. It was the framework upon which the U.S. Army constructed every movement. Sherman tanks demonstrated this most clearly. When a platoon met resistance, whether from a hidden anti-tank gun or infantry dug into a hedgerow, the first instinct was not to charge forward, but to call for immediate suppression. The phrase became a fixture of armored communications. A tank commander needed only to relay a target direction and estimated range for artillery to begin carving open a path. Within moments, shells bracketed enemy positions with such efficiency that the Shermans could resume their advance before the Germans had time to relocate. The tank's armor, often criticized for its vulnerability, was compensated by a deeper protection, the knowledge that artillery could intervene at any moment. Infantry units embraced the same pattern. Battalion commanders came to rely on fire missions to shape engagements before a single squad crossed open ground. A suspected machine gun nest, a fortified farmhouse, or a tree line concealing German riflemen, all were treated as preliminary obstacles to be softened by precise, coordinated barrages. American troops learned to pause, wait for the distant thunder to arrive, and advance only once the landscape had been transformed. It was an approach that traded time for certainty, enabling units with limited combat experience to confront entrenched veterans on more equal terms. In the bocage, where each field formed a miniature fortress and every hedge concealed potential ambush, this integration proved decisive. German defenses that once required hours of grinding combat could be reduced in minutes. A forward observer would identify an opening, call for fire from several batteries, and watch as the combined barrage dissolved the resistance. Only then would assault teams breach the hedgerow, advancing into a space that had already been emptied of threat. German accounts describe entire platoons disappearing under these coordinated attacks before they could fire a single shot. For American commanders, artillery became the instrument that allowed movement in terrain designed to deny it. The thick Norman hedges slowed armor, fragmented infantry formations, and favored defenders who knew how to exploit every contour of the land. Yet with artillery serving as the great equalizer, the Americans found a way to convert static fighting into deliberate momentum. Fire missions cleared lanes, neutralized machine guns, and disrupted counterattacks before they formed. What might have been weeks of attritional combat became an advance measured in steady, controlled gains. German officers, observing these developments, reached a sobering conclusion. The Americans' shortcomings, less aggressive infantry doctrine, lighter armor, the inexperience of many divisions, were being compensated by a firepower system that operated with machine-like consistency. They noted that the U.S. Army's strength did not lie in individual superiority, but in collective efficiency. Every tactical weakness found reinforcement through artillery. Every German advantage was blunted by barrages that arrived too quickly to exploit. By August, innovation had reached its peak. The American way of war had taken shape not through a single weapon or breakthrough, but through interlocking processes that magnified each other's power. Artillery no longer supported the battle, it defined it. Flexibility replaced rigidity, speed replaced method, and precision replaced the traditional reliance on sheer volume. It was a doctrine built on coordination, mathematics, and the relentless pursuit of responsiveness. And as the front expanded beyond the bocage and into open country, this system, refined in the dense hedgerows, was about to demonstrate its full, unrestrained potential. By late July 1944, the Norman front had settled into a grim, static contest. Hedgerows fortified into miniature fortresses, roads cut by ambush fire, and German divisions clinging to every ridgeline as if the landscape itself were their final ally. But behind the American lines, a shift was forming. Operation Cobra, planned as the hinge that would break open the German position, was built not on armor or daring maneuver, but on a scale of artillery preparation the Germans had never faced. It was here, on a narrow sector west of Saint-Lô, that American firepower began to reshape an entire campaign. In the early hours of the operation, the countryside lay still beneath a low sky, the light muted by dust and morning haze. American guns stood ready in rows, 105s, 145s, and the heavier 8-inch howitzers, all plotted on precise grids, all waiting for the call that would open the path to the interior of France. When the order finally came, the first shells lifted into the sky with a steady, mechanical rhythm. These were not exploratory shots, but calculated blows, each landed on coordinates designed to isolate German positions before a single infantryman moved forward. Villages that had resisted for weeks found themselves cut off, their routes of reinforcement severed by timed concentrations that fell with clinical certainty. As the preparatory fire intensified, proximity-fused rounds joined the barrage, detonating above trenches and weapon pits. The air bursts produced lethal showers of shrapnel that descended in wide, unforgiving cones. The Germans had long relied on deep digging to survive bombardment, but in Cobra, the earth offered no safety. The fuses turned cover into vulnerability, striking from angles that trenches had never been designed to withstand. Survivors recounted the surreal violence of it, shocks that came from nowhere, fragments that reached behind earthen walls, and the unnerving sense that the shells had learned to ignore the ground entirely. German units that had once prided themselves on resilience under fire now found their discipline strained to the breaking point. Battle-tested formations, regiments that had endured the Eastern Front and North Africa, could not endure the combined weight of precision and volume. Their communications collapsed, their artillery was drowned in counter-battery fire, and their defensive belts crumbled in segments. Positions that had taken weeks to organize dissolved within minutes. Officers trying to reposition their men discovered that any movement, however small, drew immediate attention from American observers, whose radios linked them directly to waiting batteries. Panzer units attempted counterattacks with the confidence of earlier campaigns. They assembled behind the front, rumbling into motion as they had so many times before, concentrated, decisive, ready to restore order. Yet each time, massed American fire met them in transition. Columns were struck before they reached the line of departure, armored spearheads broken apart by barrages that arrived as if anticipating every turn of the road. Tank crews could neither maneuver nor retreat without exposing themselves further. What had once been the German army's most feared instrument became a collection of isolated vehicles, each forced to move under skies filled with invisible calculations. With German lines fragmented and their counterattacks stifled, American commanders exploited the moment with new confidence. Artillery opened corridors, narrow spaces where German defenses had been precisely dismantled. Into these gaps poured mobile units, armored divisions, reconnaissance elements, and infantry riding in half-tracks. The speed was startling. What had been a battlefield defined by inches became one measured in miles. German forces, accustomed to dictating tempo through carefully timed withdrawals and flank defenses, found themselves unable to react. The American advance was no longer a contest of maneuver, but the natural consequence of artillery that controlled space as effectively as any weapon in the field. By the end of Cobra, the German army understood the full transformation that had taken place. This was not the artillery they had known in earlier wars, slow, methodical, limited by line of sight. It was decisive, shaping battles before they began, closing options before they could be acted upon. The Americans had not merely improved their gunnery, they had reorganized war itself around the application of measured, synchronized force. And as the Allied armies surged into the French interior, the implications of this shift were only beginning to reveal themselves. In December 1944, as snow settled across the Ardennes and the forests lay silent beneath a pale winter sun, German hopes rose once more. The surprise offensive, planned with secrecy, fueled by desperation, and launched through terrain the Allies considered unlikely, aimed to fracture the Western Front in a single decisive stroke. Columns of armor pressed through narrow valleys, infantry advanced beneath the cover of fog, and commanders believed that winter itself would mask their intentions. For a moment, it seemed as though the war had turned back upon its axis. Yet amid the confusion of the opening days, one element of the American defense held firm: its artillery. Scattered across ridge lines, villages, and frozen clearings, U.S. batteries became the stabilizing spine of a front otherwise bent by shock. Communications flickered under the strain of the attack, units found themselves isolated, and roads became clogged with retreating traffic. Still, the guns continued to speak. Their positions shifted constantly, their missions multiplied, and their signatures faded into the cold air before German counter-battery crews could respond. Where other formations withdrew to regroup, artillery remained, anchoring pockets of resistance with an unbroken rhythm of fire. The winter itself magnified their effect. Frozen soil, hardened by weeks of low temperatures, transmitted the shock of high explosive shells with unusual force. Instead of absorbing impacts, the ground reflected them, amplifying concussion and fragmentation. Men caught in the open felt blasts, as if the earth beneath them had turned to iron. Snow, blanketing the landscape in deceptive softness, offered no protection. It concealed craters, muted sound, and left advancing troops exposed against the white fields. What had been intended as ideal weather for a surprise offensive turned into an element that strengthened American firepower. Inside the towns and villages that formed the nodes of the American defense, forward observers carried out their work under conditions that would have broken less disciplined armies. Bastogne, St. Vith, and other isolated strongholds were surrounded, their supplies dwindling, their defenders exhausted. Yet observers continued to climb church towers, attic stairwells, and half-collapsed rooftops, relaying coordinates with icy fingers over radios that barely functioned in the cold. Artillery missions remained startlingly accurate despite the siege, guiding fire from batteries miles away that could neither see the enemy nor hear the battle's front edge. This silent partnership between besieged observers and distant guns allowed isolated garrisons to strike far beyond their perimeter. When German infantry advanced across open meadows, fields once used for summer grazing, now frozen into broad, white expanses, the proximity fuse revealed its full winter lethality. Shells burst above the snowpack, scattering metal fragments that skipped and ricocheted across the hard surface. Formations dissolved under airburst patterns perfectly suited to the terrain, their movement betrayed by dark shapes against the pale ground. The very conditions the Germans had counted on for concealment became the backdrop for their own devastation. German diaries from the Ardennes are filled with references to artillery, far more than tank battles or small arms fire. Soldiers described barrages as inescapable, noting that every attempt to exploit a breakthrough met a curtain of shells that appeared without warning. Commanders wrote of counterattacks stalled before they could reach the line of departure, of columns forced to abandon roads choked with craters, of morale eroding as each new push dissolved under synchronized explosions. The offensive, conceived as a bold stroke of maneuver warfare, found itself blunted not by numbers or fortifications, but by the precision of guns hidden behind ridges and tree lines. As the battle stretched into January, the deeper irony became impossible to ignore. The Ardennes, its snow, its forests, its narrow roads, had always been assumed to favor the attacker who moved quickly and struck hard. German armor had relied on these conditions, imagining that weather and terrain would slow the Allies and conceal their thrust. Instead, the very elements meant to empower the offensive served to magnify American firepower. Snow revealed movement. Frozen soil amplified shockwaves. Narrow defiles funneled German units into predictable paths, where artillery could reach them with mathematical certainty. What began as Germany's final gamble ended as a testament to American artillery's resilience under the worst conditions the winter could offer. And in the fading cold of early 1945, a new question emerged: how much further this firepower would shape the last battles still to come. By the opening months of 1945, the German army faced a reality more suffocating than defeat. It could no longer move. Maneuver, the principle upon which its doctrine, reputation, and early victories had been built, had ceased to function. Every attempt to shift forces, reinforce a sector, or withdraw to a more defensible line seemed to trigger the same response: an eruption of American artillery, precise and unrelenting, falling as if it had been waiting for them long before they arrived. Across the shattered landscapes of the Rhineland and Western Germany, American fire direction centers had mapped bridges, crossroads, rail junctions, and major roadways with meticulous care. These points, once the connective tissue of German operations, became traps. Observers positioned on ridges and in reconnaissance aircraft relayed even the smallest sign of movement. The moment a German column approached a known crossing, shells converged with mechanical certainty. In some sectors, artillery units had pre-calculated firing solutions for every likely avenue of retreat. German troops would later remark that the Americans seemed to know their routes better than they did. As the front receded toward the Reich's interior, artillery pressure intensified. American batteries followed the retreat with a persistence that gave no room to reorganize. During the day, columns were struck as they attempted to move along exposed roads. At night, fire missions continued with equal precision, guided by sound-ranging equipment, radar, and night-trained observers. Rest became scarce. Sleep was fragmented by sudden barrages that forced units to scatter, and when they regrouped, the process repeated. The relentlessness was not born of spite, but of procedure, an efficient, systematic reduction of mobility aimed at breaking the last coherent patterns of German resistance. Commanders began reporting catastrophic losses before their formations even reached the battlefield. Entire battalions were mauled during movement, vehicles abandoned after repeated airbursts detonated above them, and infantry depleted by fragmentary casualties that accumulated day after day. Unit diaries described the same bleak pattern. Planned deployments rendered impossible because the march itself invited destruction. A battalion that should have reinforced a river line might arrive too diminished to hold it. Another, intended for a counterattack, might be scattered across fields long before a single shot was fired. Counterattacks, the foundation of German defensive doctrine, became illusory. Assembly points, chosen for concealment, instead acted as magnets for American fire. A platoon forming up in a grove of trees could be dissolved before it took a step. A company hidden behind a ridgeline could be shattered by pre-registered concentrations without ever being spotted directly. Officers learned to fear congregation as much as exposure. The act of preparing a counterattack carried more danger than the attack itself. The doctrine that had defined German flexibility since the earliest days of Blitzkrieg was now reduced to a theoretical exercise, impossible to execute under real conditions. Even armored divisions, once the spear point of German operations, found themselves paralyzed. Tanks attempting to relocate drew immediate fire, forced to disperse separately rather than maneuver as cohesive units. Movement under fire created bottlenecks. Bottlenecks created targets. A single mistaken halt could doom an entire column. Armor that had once symbolized momentum now existed as isolated silhouettes, hunted not by enemy panzers, but by mathematics executed at distance. By spring, German generals understood the magnitude of the shift. Their traditional strengths, swift decision-making, local initiative, coordinated movement, had been methodically dismantled. American artillery had created a form of battlefield governance that overwhelmed even experienced commanders. It denied the Germans the time needed to think, the space needed to organize, and the freedom needed to act. Every corner of the front felt watched. Every path forward felt pre-measured. The collapse of maneuver was not simply a tactical failure. It was the end of a military identity forged over decades. An army that had defined modern warfare through motion now found itself immobilized by a weapon that required no movement at all, only calculation, communication, and the quiet patience to wait for its target to step into range. As the final winter gave way to spring, a bitter truth settled over the retreat. The battlefield no longer belonged to the army that moved fastest. It belonged to the army that could calculate faster, and in 1945, that race had already been decided. In the years following the war, when surviving German officers were interviewed in Allied camps, universities, and post-war study groups, a rare consistency emerged from men who had disagreed on almost everything else. They spoke with notable precision about American artillery. The same men who had once entered the conflict, convinced of their own technical and doctrinal superiority, now described U.S. firepower with terms that carried neither flattery nor resignation, only recognition. Again and again, they returned to the same conclusion. American artillery had been the finest in the world. Their language was calm, clinical, and often admiring. Some called U.S. fire missions astonishingly quick, noting that corrections arrived so rapidly they seemed to anticipate movement. Others referred to the barrages as uniformly deadly, not simply powerful, but dependable across every front and every season. Even officers who had fought at Kursk or Stalingrad, men hardened by the largest artillery duels of the war, remarked on the unusual blend of speed and precision they encountered in France and the Ardennes. It was this combination, they said, that separated American guns from all others. Their assessments pointed not to a single weapon, but to a system. They observed how technology, training, and decentralization had fused into a coherent whole. Radios linked observers directly to batteries. Standardized equipment allowed units to mesh seamlessly. Mathematical procedures eliminated hesitation. Many admitted they had underestimated this structure during the war, mistaking the seeming informality of American communications for disorder rather than flexibility. What looked like improvisation from a distance revealed itself as a disciplined method when studied after the fighting stopped. Even the iconic German weapons, those that had shaped their battlefield identity, offered no remedy. The 88, celebrated for its accuracy and feared for its versatility, proved irrelevant against an adversary whose fire missions could envelop entire sectors, regardless of individual gun duels. Heavy howitzers and Nebelwerfer rocket batteries, long considered tools of disruption, could not compete with the coordination of U.S. battalions operating as if they were a single organism. The Germans recognized that their artillery, though technically excellent, had been trapped within a rigid doctrine while the Americans had built theirs to adapt. Several senior officers concluded that the American way of war had not been defined by armor, as popular memory sometimes suggested, but by artillery. Tanks advanced because the guns created space. Infantry survived because the guns broke resistance. The operational tempo, how fast a division could move, regroup, or strike, was dictated by how quickly artillery could shift its fire. And in this domain, the Americans held a decisive and often overwhelming advantage. These reflections rarely carried bitterness. Instead, They conveyed a sober respect born from confrontation with an unexpected strength. The Germans did not portray themselves as victims of superior machines, but as soldiers who had faced a military system more thoroughly integrated than their own. In their view, the outcome had hinged less on individual talent and more on method, on the ability to calculate faster, communicate faster, and strike before the enemy could respond. And from their testimony, a final conclusion emerged with clarity. In the modern battlefield, firepower did not merely support the fight. It set the pace, shaped the possibilities, and determined who controlled the future of every engagement still to come. In the years after 1945, as nations rebuilt shattered societies and reconstructed their armed forces, one lesson spread quietly through military academies and planning rooms. The American field artillery system had not merely contributed to victory, it had redefined the conduct of modern war. Its principles, once viewed as experimental, became reference points for armies seeking to understand how a flexible, fast-moving force could dominate a battlefield shaped by uncertainty. The system's strength lay in its synthesis of mobility, standardization, and decentralized control, three elements that had worked in harmony rather than competition. Post-war armies recognized that this blend offered more than battlefield efficiency. It offered resilience. NATO's emerging doctrine, designed to counter Soviet mass and maneuver, drew heavily on the American model. Artillery units were taught to move often, fire rapidly, and operate as an interconnected network rather than isolated batteries. Radios, once a luxury, became indispensable. Procedures were unified so that soldiers from different nations could call for fire with the same clarity as an American forward observer in Normandy. The proximity fuse, still among the most consequential technological advancements of the war, exerted an equally deep influence. Its ability to transform a single round into a broad sphere of lethality shaped the development of anti-air defenses, counter-battery systems, and modern airburst munitions. The device's logic, that timing and sensing could be as decisive as explosive power, anticipated the precision-guided weapons of the decades to come. It quietly altered the expectations of what artillery could accomplish, shifting focus from mass alone to the marriage of accuracy and effect. German officers, reflecting on their defeat, offered a candid assessment of what their own doctrine had lacked. Many argued that the war revealed the limits of rigid command structures built on hierarchical control. The speed of American artillery fire, its ability to respond before German units could maneuver, demonstrated the necessity of decentralization. Future German and NATO field manuals emphasized this point repeatedly. Initiative had to reside with those closest to the fight, and communication had to travel in every direction, not merely downward. It was a philosophical shift, born not from theory, but from the memory of barrages that arrived too fast to counter. Dozens of innovations that defined the post-war battlefield, from helicopter-borne observers to self-propelled artillery and digital fire control systems, emerged from the lessons of 1944 and 1945. Yet these advancements were rarely celebrated in dramatic terms. Artillery remained a branch known for its restraint, present everywhere, acknowledged quietly, its influence measured not in spectacle but in outcomes. And in this understated legacy, a truth endured. The architect of modern land warfare was not always the weapon seen on the horizon, but often the one heard only in the moment before impact. Across every front where they fought the Americans, from the hedgerows of Normandy to the forests of the Ardennes and the river crossings of the Rhineland, German infantry arrived at the same conclusion, often expressed with a simplicity that carried more weight than any formal report. It was not the tank that frightened them most, nor the fighter-bomber, nor the rush of advancing infantry. It was the American artillery, unseen, unhurried, and uncannily precise. They described it not as a weapon, but as a presence, something woven into the landscape itself. What unnerved them most was the loss of security. In earlier campaigns, they had relied on the certainty that skilled movement and well-chosen positions could preserve a measure of safety. But American fire stripped those assumptions away. A grove of trees, a village corner, a ravine hidden from view, none offered refuge when every point on the map could be calculated, registered, and struck within seconds. The Germans felt as though the battlefield no longer responded to their choices. It responded only to the mathematics unfolding behind the Allied lines. Maneuver, once their signature strength, became a liability. A company shifting to counterattack risked annihilation before it reached the start line. Columns marching through snow or dust left faint trails easily spotted by a single American observer. Roads, the arteries of German mobility, transformed into killing grounds the moment movement was detected. The speed of U.S. fire missions meant that hesitation was punished, but movement was punished equally. For soldiers trained to fight through tempo and initiative, this was a form of paralysis more effective than any fortified wall. The psychological effect was deeper than physical danger. American artillery punished errors instantly and without emotion. A misplaced step, a pause in the wrong clearing, a vehicle turning too slowly at a junction could bring fire down with a swiftness that felt almost personal. Yet the indifference of the system was what unsettled them most. It was not rage or improvisation or the chaotic roar of massed batteries. It was the cold precision of a force that needed only numbers, coordinates, and procedure. Morale eroded long before positions collapsed. German units that had endured years of brutal fighting found themselves drained by a threat they could neither see nor outthink. Veterans remarked that tanks could be outflanked, aircraft could be avoided, but American artillery seemed to arrive everywhere at once, shaping each engagement before a single rifle was raised. It broke not only trenches and vehicles, but the confidence that had sustained them through the war's hardest months. In the end, the fear it inspired revealed the true foundation of American strength. Not superior armor, nor overwhelming manpower, but the disciplined coordination of thousands of moving parts, observers, radios, guns, crews, operating with a unity that denied the Germans the freedom to fight on their own terms. They feared many weapons in that war, but this was the one that never missed its mark.